Okay, hello and welcome to a particularly exciting and important video for GCSE biology. This is an absolute favourite of mine, and I think for most biology teachers they would say this is an absolute favourite. One of the main sort of reasons why you get into biology teaching is to be able to sort of share this understanding of how we got to be where we are, right? In fact, you might be able to see I've even made my little shack here a little bit more fancy in the background here, right? I've given myself a new shack ground, as I'm calling it, to tell you all about evolution and natural selection. Now, while this is mainly aimed at the GCSE topic on entitled Accepting Darwin's Ideas and Evidence for Evolution, which is towards the end of the GCSE, we're also going to cover a recap on the basics of how natural selection works, right, before we go into a bit of history and all the key players. Now, if you haven't watched the development of genetics lesson or before this, I would suggest you do that before coming on to this video. Okay, so I'm going to start with some things you might know. So this is the bits of syllabus that we're trying to cover. Okay, so development of understanding of genetics and evolutions, so the theory of evolution, and obviously the ideas around why evolution initially was a controversial idea. Okay, so as you can see here, that we've got a simple description of what Darwin's theory of evolution is, and we've also got the idea of what the origin of species was, what happened after its publication, and why it proved particularly controversial. We've also got some other scientists listed in here who are very important, people like Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. We've also got to talk a little bit in another video about Alfred, Russel, Wallace, and various other individuals who are important to this story. Okay, so you've probably all seen a ton of different pictures depicting evolution and evolutionary processes. It's one of the biggest and most important ideas in biology, in science, because it explains how we got here. Now, this whole ascent of man image, which has been parodied many times like this one, is actually a little bit misleading, and we'll get into why a little bit later. So, as a little recap, hopefully you remember what this term means: survival of the fittest, right? Literally, when we say fit, we don't always mean running, jumping, climbing trees kind of fit. We also don't mean necessarily well fit, although it can be, right? All these things are fine. All it means, the fittest organism is the one that's best adapted to whatever its environment is, okay? So the best adapted animal will survive better, breed, and pass on its genes, or more specifically, the particular alleles of the genes that it's got, which then means that in the next generation, more individuals are going to have those particular alleles, particular versions of genes that will make them better adapted to that environment. Multiply by time, and you have evolution. Okay, so let me give you some examples. We all know this, we can all see this around us all the time. There's variation in every population, both within species and between species, and variation inevitably leads to competition. Okay, and obviously, depending on what your environment is, some mutations, some alleles of some genes give better features than others. Okay, the ones with the better features will survive better and they will breed, and the ones that don't, well, they die. Okay, so over time, that means the best alleles for the environment lead to survival and reproduction. And this, on the right here, the squirrels in the UK, is a classic example. So this is our native squirrel here, the red squirrel, or squirrel nutkins down the bottom there. And this big old grey squirrel here is an American import. You probably know that already, and you probably know that the grey squirrel has been better adapted and has largely taken over most parts of the United Kingdom. Okay, reason for that, they breed faster, they're resistant to a disease that they carry that the red squirrel is not. They have bigger litters, they're better at getting food, and they take over the best nesting or dray building sites. Squirrel nest or dray, if you didn't know that. Okay, so obviously better adapted to take over the UK. Now, there is a happier coda to this story, is that it turns out one of the reasons the red squirrel was so small, right, and it didn't evolve to be larger and do this and work more like the grey squirrel, is because of a natural UK predator, which in some areas of rewilding in the UK has been brought back, and that's called a pine marten. Okay, now we're not going to linger on this too long. You can go and look at what pine martens are, but in areas where pine martens live, you're actually seeing that go back the other way. You're seeing the numbers of grey squirrels declining and the number of red squirrels increasing. Because turns out, if you're a massive fatty, like the grey squirrel here, you can't go to the end of a thin branch to escape a pine marten, which is like a ferret-like predator. Whereas if you're a little lightweight, skinny fella like the red squirrel, you can. Okay, so the environment changing favours different alleles of different genes, and obviously, as the environment changes, what's advantageous changes, and which individuals survive change. Okay, so moving on then, the other classic example you will have presumably seen in all the textbooks is the peppered moth, and this is from right here in the Midlands of the UK. The idea during the Industrial Revolution, the Black Country got its name because obviously lots of soot was being produced from the burning of coal and so on and so forth, and silver birch trees like this were stained black. So you've got a different allele in moths for their pigmentation, which occasionally makes them black. Okay, now in this natural scenario here, right, the silver birch silver, this moth, we may not even be able to see it very well down there, is obviously incredibly well camouflaged, so that one gets eaten by birds. So the allele frequency, the frequency of that allele in the population goes down, and the frequency of the pepper goes up. Right, come the Industrial Revolution, we change the environment, right, we blacken the trees, well suddenly the black allele gives an advantage, so its frequency in the population goes up, and the one of the peppered moth goes down. Okay, it doesn't take a genius to work this out, and we can actually watch this happening in real time in terms of things like giving antibiotics to colonies of bacteria. Obviously the ones that are resistant survive, the ones that don't, and so on and so forth, right? So that's natural selection for you, and of course now we've got the Clean Air Act and the Black Country is not covered in soot anymore, silver birch trees are going back to being the original colour, we can actually see a reversal back to this particular gene frequency moving up and up and up and up and up, and the one for the black moving down again. Okay, so those are two classic examples you've probably covered already. And of course this idea of natural selection leads to evolution. After a long time, the better adapted alleles of the genes, so the animals with the better genes, the alleles of those genes, spreads so that every animal in the population has them. And once you've got a particular version of an allele that every animal in the population has and all the others have died out, we call that allele fixed in the population. So that allele is now, and then the same thing happens with another one, okay, and another, and another, and another, and another. Add time, repeat. And when I'm talking about time, I'm talking about a lot of time. I'm talking about 4 billion years, okay? And there's really good metaphors with clocks and things that if we, condensed all of the time on Earth, lifetime on Earth into one 24-hour day, humans would have appeared. Modern humans would have appeared about 2 seconds to midnight. Okay, which is, and there are various other examples of that statistic depending on what you're looking for, but it's huge amounts of time. Okay, and that I think is what people sometimes struggle to imagine when we're discussing evolution. The idea of natural selection, quite easy to understand. The sheer amount of time is what causes the problem. Okay, and obviously once you do that, you've then got evolution. And this picture here on the side is an amazing image that was the first sketch that Charles Darwin drew in his notebook, right? Where he said, well, maybe, right, over time, from one common ancestor, if we have enough time and the environments change and these animals move into different environments, then we get all these branches and branches and time, and then eventually we'll get species A, B, C, and D from that original ancestor. And obviously this was his first inkling of his idea of evolution, and he wrote a tentative "I think" on top. And because I am such a biology nerd, I actually have that on a t-shirt and a mug. I didn't buy them myself, they were presents, people know me well. Okay, so essentially, over millions of years, these useful mutations build up and up and up, leading to all the species you see today, including us. Now, obviously, that's a misleading picture, right, because that depicts the idea of what is effectively a modern chimp turning into a modern human, and nobody ever says that. One of the most common questions I get in lessons is, so if humans evolved from monkeys, how come we still have monkeys? And that is, if you look at that picture, you can see where that question comes from. But obviously, that is not what I said happened. Right, what has happened is more that modern monkeys and modern humans share a common ancestor. We call it common ancestry. Okay, so that's that question. If I phrase it differently, is like saying, if I have cousins, if you're saying I came from my cousins, why do I still have cousins? Nobody said that. What we're saying is that you and your cousins share a grandparent. Okay, multiply that by 1 million generations, and that's the relationship between you and chimpanzees or any of the other primates. Okay. So that is a misleading picture, but obviously it's called the ascent of man, but it's a very famous image. Okay, so that's your recap of natural selection and evolution. Okay, so what I'd like you to do at this point, if you want to make sure that you know that information, is pause the video at this point and summarise evolution by natural selection in 4 to 6 marks, which could well be a GCSE question. Stick in the words gene, allele, mutation, advantage, survive and breed. Okay, and make sure you get all those terms in there, because they would be what you'd be expected to do in an exam. Okay, so pause the video now and have a go. Okay, so for an answer for that, hopefully you'd have something like, within a population, right, there are lots of different alleles of lots of different genes. A mutation in a gene would generate a new allele. If that new allele gave an advantage in that environment, the individuals with that allele would survive better and breed, passing on those alleles of those genes. Okay, and that's basically the summary. Right, good. So now we move on, right, and obviously this applies to us as well. We move on to more the human story, more the discovery, the science, the research, the story of Victorian explorership. But I just want to show you your family tree here, okay? Now, your proper Latin name is Homo sapiens, and we're going to come back to fossils and evidence in us in another lesson. But it's worth noting that you are just the last of the hominid group, okay? There were lots of others. You've probably heard of Homo neanderthalis, the Neanderthals here, and our ancestor Homo heidelbergensis. Now this picture here is a little bit out of date, because there is more and more evidence that there was actually gene flow between the Neanderthals and Homo sapiens that we did interbreed. And we'll talk a bit more about that when we talk about the concept of what is a species. Okay, so onwards. Of course, we need to start with the maestro Charles Darwin, but he, of course, was not the only person working on this idea, and not the only person coming up with important ideas about how species change throughout time. Okay, so Charles Darwin, obviously massively important, but not the only person. He's the man credited with this theory, and when I say theory, another common question I get is, well, it's just a theory, isn't it? Right, which of course means that people fundamentally haven't understood what the word theory means. So when we say theory, what we mean is explanation for a natural phenomena backed up by a lot of evidence. There are good theories like gravity, right, and evolution, of course, and there are bad theories like flat Earth theory, right? So he's one credited with this theory, and obviously it's been backed up, repeated, backed up, ever since his time. Okay, you can see it when he was working, 1809 to 1882. So he was one of the generation of Victorian scientists, Victorian naturalists working on this idea. You probably also know what he's famous for. He took a boat, the HMS Beagle, to the Galapagos Islands. It wasn't only the Galapagos Islands, that's the one that's famous, but he sort of circumnavigated the globe. He went to South America, did a lot of collecting of insects and various things in Brazil, and he was obviously a very keen naturalist. He studied geology and botany at Cambridge, and was massively enthralled and enamoured by collecting all these insects and storing them and so on and so forth. Okay, and famous creatures that he came and talked about, you probably know about Darwin's finches, and the beaks is the famous image, and he came up with this book, The Origin of Species. That's not the full title. Okay, you can obviously look at the book. It's got a very long, winded Victorian title. We all call it The Origin of Species, or On the Origin of Species. Okay, so that's what he did, but the gap here between him doing all this exploration and publishing his book was actually about 25 years, was huge, which is why we find that he went off around the world as a 21-year-old, came back when he was about 25, 26, and we see all the pictures of him that look like this when it's much, much later, because that's after he published his book and became sort of a bit of a household publishing name. Okay, so to give you a couple of ideas, right, so that's the Beagle. Can you imagine spending 5 years on that thing, going around the world? That's obviously very tricky. That's the Galapagos Islands. They are a series of volcanic islands about 600 miles off the coast of Ecuador in South America. So you've got obviously volcanoes sort of over this side, which basically spew up islands, and they push due to tectonic and geological forces towards South America. So San Cristobal here is the oldest island, and Fernandina is the newest one. And then Isabella here, obviously, you can see was made by a series of volcanoes, which you can just about see there. So this is a perfect place for life to colonise in a new environment and then undergo some quite radical evolutionary forces. Now, the famous image was obviously the finches, right? Obviously, each of those has got different amounts of water on it, those islands, and different amounts of food, different types of food. So to get different types of food, you're going to need a different beak. So the same ancestral finch will have evolved different beaks on different islands. The idea that the ones on an island that have a lot of insects need to be dug out of somewhere, well, your finches with a long pointy beak are going to survive, and the ones that don't have that will die. And the ones with a lot of nuts, you need a big heavy beak to crack those, so therefore the finches with a heavier beak will survive and the rest will die. Give that time and you end up with a different finch on every island. Okay, so nowadays, however, this is from my trip to the Galapagos Island with a bunch of my students in 2014. Now, however, the finches seem to have adapted to fulfill the niche of a seagull, right? Because as you can see, look, right, they will quite happily land on your sandwich and steal your bread while they're staring you in the eye and go, I'm a protected species, what are you going to do, right? So now they seem to be adapting. I don't know what beak is best for stealing an A-level student's bread, but you know, that's evolution. It makes the most of the available opportunities. Okay, and of course there's the incredibly famous species there that aren't just the finches. You've got the blue and red-footed boobies here. This is another photo from my expedition in 2014. Right, we do that, the dance, the famous dance with the feet. If you've never seen the blue-footed booby mating dance or red-footed booby mating dance, then have a look. It's hilarious. And the only marine iguana in the world. So this is an iguana, so a lizard, right? A cold-blooded animal that swims out into the sea to feed on kelp. Okay, and again, this was a picture I took when we were trying to get down to the water to go snorkeling in the bay that Darwin arrived on San Cristobal via. Okay, so and then of course the famous and highly charismatic tortoises, which again the shape of that curve in their shell gives evidence that they were adapting to different islands with different conditions. Now they're obviously incredible things, and if you can find them, it is incumbent on you to take yourself a lovely selfie. Okay, now Darwin of course wasn't the first, okay? Lots of other people, as I say, were having ideas and thoughts about how we got here, and this is the point on your syllabus, right? The idea of knowing some of these other ideas from some of these other people, okay? So way back when, Aristotle, he sort of, an ancient Greek philosopher, he came up with the idea that animals wanted to get more complex, so they were constantly pushing to become more complex, and those that hadn't just hadn't tried hard enough yet. Now, obviously, he was proven wrong with the idea that a lot of animals, organisms like bacteria, insects, stay relatively simple compared to humans, depending on your definition of simple, over long periods of time. Then we get to sort of the Victorian era. So you've got a guy in France called Jean-Baptiste Lamarck and Charles Darwin, and then another fella called Alfred Russel Wallace, who's very important. Okay, now your syllabus specifically says that you need to know the different ideas between Jean-Baptiste Lamarck and Charles Darwin. Okay, so let's look a little bit at Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. So he was a brilliant French scientist, working slightly earlier than Darwin. He comes in for a lot of stick with this bit where it's oh, what a stupid idea, Darwin was right, and sometimes that's used to be like, oh, stupid French science, our British science was much better, which is nonsense. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck was a brilliant scientist, contributed hugely to the field of natural sciences, and was an incredibly influential figure in his time. But on the exact mechanism of evolution, he was wrong. Right? He, like Darwin, could see that animals changed over time, but he came up with the wrong mechanism of how that worked. He said that all creatures acquire qualities in life and then pass them on to their offspring. Okay, so he was evolution by acquired characteristics. What he meant by that, right, was the idea that if a giraffe stretches its neck up to a tall branch to eat over its entire life, so it's stretching and its neck's getting longer and longer, right, then that stretching will be passed on to the offspring, and the idea of then that offspring would continue the stretching, and over many generations the stretching would be inherited. Now, knowing what you know about DNA and genes and all that kind of stuff, you can probably look at that and, well, that's a stupid idea. But obviously, this is in, he was born in 1744. Okay, so it seemed a reasonable explanation. He did some crazy experiments with rats where he got a load of rats and a meat cleaver, and he was just chopping off their tails and making them breed and seeing if they had shorter tails. And he did this generation after generation and generation. And of course, they didn't have a shorter tail because, as we know, the instructions for making a tail are in the DNA, in the genes, not in the tail, right? So that was obviously very important. An experiment. He actually did come to the conclusion, well, they got slightly smaller, and maybe I just needed to do it for longer, which obviously, once you've had this idea and you've sort of doubled down on it, it's a bit hard to back down on that point. But really, it was quite clear at the time that wasn't what was going on. Okay, so if we sort of line them up side by side on their explaining of a giraffe, okay, and this is something you could be asked to do, what would Darwin have said about this species? What would Lamarck have said about this species? Well, Darwin, as we know, would have said the species will show variation already as a result of mutations in their genes, different alleles, so there'll already be variation there, and the environment will select between the better competitors. So it makes some members of the species more suitable to the environment, they're the better competitors. So he would have said to the giraffe already, some of them already had a slightly longer neck due to their genes, they would have survived and the shorter ones would have died. Okay? So this means that the better competitors survive, reach breeding age, pass on the genes which made them suitable, pass on the alleles of their genes that made them more suitable. Okay, so that would have been Darwin's idea. Lamarck's idea, on the other hand, would have gone like this. During its life, the giraffe acquired a longer neck, so acquisition of a longer neck, because giraffes were always stretching their neck to reach food on high branches. Okay, their necks get a little bit longer, and then they stayed that way. And when they reproduced, that acquired characteristic was passed on to the offspring. And over many generations, this continued and the necks got longer and longer. So this obviously raises a bunch of interesting questions, like what kind of acquired characteristic counts? Does learning count? So for example, if parents went to school and learned their times tables, would their children automatically be born knowing their times tables? Well, we know that's not the case. If your parents learn to play piano, do you automatically know how to play piano? Well, you don't. Otherwise, why are we doing this if your parents have had this lesson when they went to school? So clearly Lamarck was wrong on this idea and Darwin was correct, but that shouldn't diminish his other contributions to the field of natural science. Okay, so that's Darwin versus Lamarck. And Alfred Russel Wallace, of course, was another very important person. Now, if they'd had email at the time, we might be talking about Wallace's theory of evolution, not Darwin's. But we'll do more on him in another lesson because he was absolutely critical to the idea of speciation, how we get new species. So very similar dates, as you can see, slightly younger than Darwin. He came up with the same idea as Darwin, having never met him, and he was working on completely the other side of the world. I'll say more on that in another lesson. And he is, of course, like Darwin, correct. So this part of the syllabus, the controversy, why Darwin didn't publish initially. So as you heard, I've always said, he got back from his round the world trip when he was 25, 26, and he didn't publish till he was 50. Okay, so huge gap. But he did what all good scientists should do at that point and spent that 25 years gathering evidence to support his idea. Okay, so he didn't publish for years and years and years. He delayed publishing his book for years and years and years, basically because he was afraid that his theory would cause a civilized world to collapse. He realised the power of the church at the time, and his wife was a devout Christian, his wife Emma, and obviously they had their own personal tragedies as well. They lost a child, he lost his son, and obviously there were other things going on in other sort of confounding ideas, and he wasn't particularly much of a showman in terms of pushing his ideas forward. He was a scientist, a very diligent naturalist. Okay, but I say with the support of other scientists like Wallace and the work of Mendel, he published his book in 1859. Okay, now when I say support of Wallace, basically he got wind that Wallace was onto the same idea but hadn't spent the time gathering the evidence. So thought, well, it's now or never, or it's going to be Wallace's theory of evolution. Okay, and obviously then we've already discussed the link between Gregor Mendel and his idea on genes and the ideas of evolution. And there we have a picture of a first edition of On the Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. If in some dusty loft you find a big pile of books and you do find an early edition of On the Origin of Species, don't chuck it out, don't take it to the charity shop. They are worth hundreds of thousands of pounds now. Such an important book, right? Hundreds of thousands of pounds, and it has never been out of print since 1859 when it was first published. Okay, so what happened, of course? Well, initially when he published the book, well, nothing really happened. It sold out. When he presented his idea to the Linnean Society, they didn't really think very much of it. Yeah, okay, that's quite interesting. But it was only when the church got hold of it, and a guy I think William Wilberforce got hold of it and attacked it on the idea that obviously they thought it ran against the idea of God. Okay, Darwin's theory obviously explained how we got to be where we are without needing there to be a God. It basically went against the Adam and Eve, magic rib and a snake and an apple story. Okay, and the cartoonists at the time, the satirists at the time, sort of did a lot of this kind of thing over here, mocking Darwin. In fact, the captain of the Beagle, with whom Darwin spent 5 years around the world, I think he described it as the ramblings of the inhaler of mephitic gas or something like that. Basically, called Darwin a druggie. He calls him off out of his mind. However, Darwin was correct and is correct. This is how species change over time. Many people saw, obviously, how good his theory was, moved away from creationism. He didn't have all the evidence that we have now, which is one of the reasons why his idea, like any scientific idea, wasn't accepted initially. And that, again, is an answer you give if this topic comes up on an exam. So the idea, what was the problem then, right? So these are the 3 points we want to stick to. We want to stick to the science here, okay? So the theory challenged the idea that God made all the animals and planets that live on Earth, okay? There was insufficient evidence at the time that the theory was published because we didn't know about genes, which leads us to the third point. The mechanism of inheritance, as per our history of genetics lesson, wasn't known until 50 years after this book was actually published. Okay, so you will know from that video that around the turn 1900 term, people were first seeing chromosomes down the microscope and thinking, hey, hang on a minute, is this something to do with what the monk was going on about with his peas, and working out the ideas of inheritance and heredity. Darwin doesn't know that, and if you at this point, and if you read on the Origin of Species, all the stuff about his all the stuff about inheritance and genetics is actually the weakest bit, where he's kind of speculating about what the mechanism of this actually is. So that's obviously an obvious gap that we now have filled. Okay, but of course you don't need to go too far into the religious and the sort of theological side of things, because this is of course a science course, but it does say on the syllabus in big bold letters, which I'm very pleased about, a study of creationism is not required. Okay, is not required. So you will not get marks for talking about creationism, because of course it is not relevant or accurate in this idea. Okay, it's not an RE exam. We don't need to talk about creationism. We want to stick to the science and those points that are there, taken directly from the syllabus. Okay, and again, I've got another picture here, another example of some of the satire, some of the attacking that was done at the time. This is an American cartoon. The idea, that this brute here could have evolved from a monkey, but these people in church couldn't have done. Okay, which obviously is a unbelievable simplification and misunderstanding of what we've just discussed in this lesson. Okay, so that's my version of this little bit of the syllabus, but of course, the master of conveying this is David Attenborough. Okay, and he has done a wonderful video called Charles Darwin and the Tree of Life, which was released in 2009 to commemorate the 200 years of his birth and the 150th of the Origin of Species. And I strongly recommend you get hold of this. It is literally the best summary of this topic, right? If you can watch that video for the 58 minutes that it is, right? Concentrate, pay attention, put your phone away, right? Watch it, right? You will be well up, right, on evolution at both the GCSE and probably, to be honest, an A-level standard as well. Okay, that's it for today. Next up, we're going to go into a bit more of the evidence of how do we know species become different species, how things change over time, fossils, anatomy, genetics, all that good stuff. So thanks very much for listening. I'll see you next time.